2015 you graduated?
Yep, 14, 15.
And so he and Brandon Miller, who now works for New Balance in Boston, they were the first two PhD students, is that correct? Mississippi State's do you call it the neuromechanics program or biomechanics?
It's PhD in exercise science, but we're focusing on neuromechanics.
That's kind of your concentration, I guess. Well, anyway, so they've done a great job and really set a kind of a pipeline. We've sent them students, they've sent us students, and hopefully we've got another undergrad that they said is excellent. So we're being overrun by bulldogs. Did you bring your cowbell today? No? Anyway, so then Ethan is from Kentucky. He went to the UK, and you got your undergrad and master's, and I got to work with a lot of baseball. Baseball pitching was what he started out with, but now he said you're working on hitting.
I'm doing mostly hitting research. I'll talk about it.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, I'm going to let them talk so they have as much time as they can get in before our next class starts. Ooh, that was close. We appreciate
it. Kind of already hit this here. So like I said, I did come here for a year. Decided I wanted to go a different route than exercise physiology. So I'm focusing on biomechanics, neuromechanics. So we're going to kind of talk about that today, just kind of give you a brief overview as to what that is. So our lab that we have at Mississippi State, we use video analysis software, force plates, and electromyography. Well, that's stuff you can measure muscle activity with. So we look at all that kind of stuff. This is our lab. So you can see here we've got 12 cameras. These are 3D cameras. So if you've ever watched how they make animated movies or video games, things like that, bring people into a lab and put markers on them, let them move around. That's how we analyze people's movement. So this is our lab. This is kind of what we do here. As a participant, we had on National Biomechanics Day this past April, just kind of doing some different movements, us teaching undergrads how to use the system, what the data actually tells us whenever we process it, things like that. So just some current research we currently have going on. I'm on a couple papers with Dr. O'Neill with weighted bench training and performance. I just submitted a paper to a journal looking at different military footwear on lateral ankle sprain stuff, so I want to talk about that today as well. And then we currently have a study that we're waiting for the IRB to approve, where we're going to look at the effects of knowing if you're going to land on an inverted surface or not. See how your landing mechanics change with and without your knowledge of stepping down onto something that's not stable. So that's kind of what we have going on right now. Ethan's going to talk a little bit about his baseball research that he's got going on. He's working on an IRB right now for a hitting study that he wants to do. So he knows more about that side. I do more injury stuff, so I'm going to talk about that today as well. So, little overview, basic biomechanic concepts. I have to go through those real quick just so you're not like, man, what are these guys even talking about? I have no idea. So, probably you've heard of kinematics, kinetics, and I just told you about EMG. And then how do we actually apply that in a laboratory setting? That's kind of what we're going to cover today. All right, so anybody here know what biomechanics is? Or a definition of biomechanics? What is it? What?
Physics applied to human.
Okay, that's very, very close. So the application of mechanical principles to the study of biological systems. So if you think about humans, we are made up of multiple segments. Bones make up our joints, right? But we are not viewed as machines. So hence the term bio. But anatomical and physical properties will always influence how we analyze somebody's movement. A lot of this stuff is what we do here. We can calculate all these things. So reasons to study biomechanics. Same thing in exercise physiology. Improve someone's performance. But we can also look at reducing someone's risk of injury. Everything that you do has some type of risk, whether that's in sports, job, anything. There is a risk of injury. Believe it or not, a lot of people overlook different occupations. So we actually do a lot with military, firefighters, police officers, and even recently I've been doing some stuff with railroad workers because they work on ballast. They work on really uneven surfaces. High potential there for an injury working in that kind of setting. So we kind of talked about this up in the lab. You have to establish a frame of reference when you analyze anything. Okay, what's positive, what's negative. Establish a fixed position to specify a positive value, a negative value. That just means the direction. Okay? And we have to define our axis. If we're looking at angular stuff, we have to define an axis. So anything that's a counterclockwise rotation will be positive. clockwise rotation is going to be negative. So that's indicated here. All right, kinematics. Everybody know what kinematics is? Kinematics. Dr. Ono, you should know what kinematics is.
I know what it is. I was going to let other people answer if they wanted to.
Everybody know what kinematics is? All right, Dr. Ono, what's kinematics?
It's the study of motion without that consideration for application of force.
Yeah, so it's going to be a study of motion without considering what is causing that motion. So these are things such as velocity, acceleration, and sometimes the term acceleration gets used incorrectly, and if you are biomechanics nerds like us, it'll drive you crazy, but if you're a normal person, you don't know any better, that's okay. Usually referred to as speeding up or slowing down. Thought of as an increase in a person's velocity, but you also accelerate when you slow down. So who's heard the term deceleration? It's incorrect. It's negative acceleration. So because you can actually, so deceleration actually indicates that something is slowing down or becoming negative. Well, you can actually, based on your frame of reference here, you can actually be gaining velocity in a negative direction with a negative acceleration. So we like to use negative or positive acceleration there. Right? Then that's going to be linear. So you can also have the same thing with angular, and we look at that a lot too. Angular velocity, how fast a rigid body is rotating, or the change in rate of angular velocity. With my undergrad classes and stuff, I like to use the example of a swing set. Okay, you have an axis and you have something that rotates around that axis. That's going to be your angular motion that you kind of analyze there. Same thing with swimming, anything you do. Okay, your joints rotate, but we produce linear movement, so we can look at how joints rotate and analyze that movement as well. Planes and axes. This should be reviewed if you've had some type of anatomy class or something like that. We have to know what plane it is that we're looking in and what motion we can actually analyze. So we have sagittal, frontal, and transverse planes. So the sagittal plane, we can do things such as flexion, extension, plantar flexion, and dorsiflexion at the ankle. Transverse plane down here at the bottom, internal and external rotation. And then frontal plane, knee valgus or varus, that's kind of that knee collapse, or AV and adduction. And for me, if I'm looking at the ankle, foot angle inversion and eversion. Kinetics, Dr. O'Neill said, without the cause. So kinetics is going to be looking at the cause of motion. So we're going to look at forces here. Based off of Newton's 3 laws of motion, which are the law of inertia. So an object or a person will stay at rest or in motion unless acted on by an outside force. Or the angular sense, moment of inertia, same thing, an object or a person will continue to rotate unless a force stops it or alters its motion. F equals ma, mass times acceleration, or if we're looking at the angular sense, moment or torque, it's going to be inertia times angular acceleration. And then action and reaction, which is my favorite, probably heard of it before, the ground reaction force. That's my favorite. So that's going to be Newton's first, second, and third laws that we all apply in our research. So ground reaction force that's a physical attraction between an object and its surroundings. Ground reaction force produced by the supporting surface. So anytime you apply a force to something, such as the ground, it's going to apply a force right back up onto you. We can analyze that, make interpretations about it. Think about jumping, running, walking, cutting, anything like that. We can analyze the ground reaction force. It's going to tell us a lot of different things. So we analyze it in 3 dimensions: medial, lateral, anterior, posterior, and vertical. Okay? Medial, lateral, and anterior, posterior are considered shear forces. So they're not going to be as large as a vertical ground reaction force, but we can also make interpretations from those. Okay? Our favorite, inverse dynamics. You may or may not know what that is. But in biomechanics, you have to do a lot of math. So if you don't like math, that's okay. You can still be good at biomechanics. Our professor, Dr. Chainer, hates math, but he loves biomechanics. Inverse dynamics is just a method by which we measure accelerations, and we have to solve backwards to figure out the forces that cause that motion. So we use kinematic information to calculate back to the kinetics forces and moments, or torques, that actually produce that particular movement. And then, it's hard to see here, but all 3 of these pieces of paper is just one problem. It's one problem for one joint, so like an ankle or a knee. So we can look all the way up. So if we're looking at gait, if someone's running, we can calculate moments at the ankle, knee, and the hip. We just have to do probably 9 pages of work. Luckily, we have technology now that does it for us. But the way to learn learn to know exactly what it is that you're looking at is to actually do it by hand. So this was actually from a day I had to study for comps this past semester. So lots of fun like that. So, and then EMG, so this represents spatial and temporal summation of all the motor unit action potentials in an area. So in layman's terms, muscle activity. So if you want to look at how active your muscles are during certain movements, we can make interpretations based off of the graph down here. And this isn't actually somebody from our lab or anything, but we just picked this picture because we have this new Naraxon EMG system that is completely wireless. So these are the little small transducers that you put on the large muscle bellies, and it sends a signal to a computer. So we don't have to have somebody hooked up to a computer and hold their wires anymore. We can completely tell them to move around as far as they want within our space, and it's going to measure this. Now with our equipment that we have we have force plates and those motion capture cameras. We can time sync all three of those things to get one data file. So a lot of different things that we can do now with this data. Okay. Guess we'll get into our research stuff. So what is the application for all of this? So my research area started out with sports performance, and as I've kind of progressed through grad school, I've really come to like injury mechanics. So people are going to get injured, whether that's in sports, the general population, at work. So a huge application for that. So I study mostly foot and ankle injuries, mostly ankle sprains. So just by a show of hands, who's ever sprained your ankle before? Okay. Mostly everyone in here. It's the most common injury, and we're going to talk about it. So at the ankle, you have three main joints. Okay, you have your talocrural joint, which everyone calls this your ankle joint. Okay, it's going to be the articulation of your tibia, your fibula, and your talus. You're going to allow dorsiflexion and plantar flexion at that joint. Okay, then you have your subtalar joint, which is going to be the articulation between the calcaneus right here and the talus, and that's where inversion and eversion is going to take place. So generally, that is where excessive inversion occurs when you sprain your ankle. Then your syndesmosis joint, or what we call the high ankle joint, is just going to be the articulation between the tibia and the fibula right above the talus. Okay. Ligaments, so when you sprain your ankle, you damage the ligaments that support the structure. So ligaments provide structural support to your ankle. Mostly here, the lateral ligaments are the most commonly sprained ligaments. Does anyone know why the lateral ligaments are the most commonly sprained ligaments? Anybody know? Think about the structure of your ankle and your foot. Okay, so if we look at this picture here, our fibula on our lateral side extends further distally than our tibia. So we have a lot more inversion range of motion than we do eversion. There's a lot greater chance that your foot can be forced into inversion there. So the most common type of ankle sprain is a lateral ankle sprain. So don't see a whole lot of medial ankle sprains because there is more structural support there, and there's less eversion range of motion to stress those ligaments. So, and then here, if you look, you can kind of see where they're named. Sorry, it's so small. All right, so ankle joint motion, dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, inversion, eversion. You also have internal rotation and external rotation. And if you combine both plantar flexion, inversion, and internal rotation, you get what's called supination. You sort of pronated or supinated feet before. That's where you get that. It's a combination of those three joint movements. Or you can have what's called pronation, which is dorsiflexion, external rotation, and eversion. Like I said, we have a lot more inversion range of motion due to this oblique axis of rotation and how the fibula actually extends further distally than the tibia. So we can get a lot more inversion there. All right. We use these in our undergrad class to kind of show what muscles contribute to what joint actions. So it's important to know your joint actions. It's also important to know the muscles that contribute to those joint actions. So we use what's called muscle circles, and depending on what quadrant the acronym falls under, will tell you what muscles are contributing to that motion. So if we look specifically just at the top part of the circle, tibialis anterior, extensor hallucis, and digitorum longus, and our peroneus tertius, those are all going to do dorsiflexion. If you look on the bottom, tibialis posterior, flexor hallucis, indigitorum longus, soleus gastroc, peroneus longus, and brevis, plantar flexion. So then if we put it in left and right halves, we have inversion, eversion. So the reason why these circles are so important is when you start looking at ankle stability, you have to know what muscles are actually providing stability in those specific planes. So if we're talking about inversion and eversion, we've got to know the muscles that contribute to eversion as well as inversion to know what muscles we should look at when we do EMG. When we simulate spraining someone's ankle, we don't actually sprain people's ankles in the lab. Okay. We have a simulator that does it. So we have to know what muscles we're actually looking at to tell if we have actual, adequate stability at that joint. So we like to use these because they're very, very easy to learn, and they're visual. If you're a visual learner like myself, you can learn all the muscles that contribute to the major joint actions in the snap of a finger just by looking at these circles. We use them in our anatomical classes. We even use these in our grad classes because the musculoskeletal anatomy is by far the most important thing to be successful at biomechanics. You don't necessarily have to be that good at math, but you have to know your musculoskeletal anatomy. You have to know it. All right, so lateral ankle sprains. Your ankle joint or joints in general support the most weight of any joint in your human body. That's going to contribute to a high rate of injury. Most common soft tissue injury in athletics, military, and in just any physically active individual. Okay, so actually in athletics, basketball, volleyball, soccer, and rugby are the highest reported. Because there is a lot of player contact, or you think about basketball or volleyball when you're jumping and landing close to someone else, you have a good opportunity to place your foot on someone else's and it's going to roll your ankle. So that's why there's a lot of them in those respective sports. And if you sprain your ankle, bad news. 80% chance that you're going to sprain it again a second time. So that is the best predictor of a future ankle sprain, is if you have a history of an ankle sprain. So 80%, that's really high. So if we took 10 people and everyone sprained their ankle, 8 out of those 10 people are going to sprain their ankle again. So that kind of creates a problem, right? So how does it actually occur? Excessive rear foot inversion. So people call this rolling your ankle, right? So if you roll your ankle, everyone thinks of that right there. So the scientific term is inversion, or a combination of rear foot inversion, internal rotation, and plantar flexion or supination. Okay? Also, we talked about the ground reaction force. The magnitude, so how much or how large that vertical ground reaction force is, and its position relative to the bottom of your foot is going to influence the moment at the ankle. So we're going to talk about that in just a second on the next slide. And then talking about the musculature of the ankle, whenever you go into excessive inversion, you get that stretch reflex of your peroneal muscle that's going to create tibial inhibition, meaning it's essentially going to turn off your tibialis anterior, and your peroneals are going to activate to try to pull your foot back into a normal position. Okay? So here, if we think about different positions of the foot, so here in the middle we have a normal or a neutral type of foot. Okay? If somebody has more of a supinated foot, then when this ground reaction force right here is applied, okay, from right here to right here, we have a larger moment arm than we do if we were to apply it right here. So here's our joint axis of, that's fancy. So here's our joint axis of rotation. Our moment arm is a perpendicular distance from that vertical ground reaction force vector, so it's a lot larger there, versus something here, where it's probably going to be somewhere along this midline of the foot, or even a foot that's in a pronated position. Probably not going to be that great of a supination moment, but somebody who does have kind of supination already, a supinated foot or structure, has a really good chance of positioning that vertical ground reaction force more medial to that subtalar joint axis of rotation. So we also look at this. We also look at foot structure. How does someone's foot structure contribute to an ankle sprain? All right, so this is, again, here you can see he's landed on a foot. Okay, that would be considered a contact injury. But over here, that foot is going into excessive inversion with a little bit of plantar flexion. So again, that would be considered a non-contact injury. Most ankle sprains are non-contact. So it could just be due to faulty movement mechanics, improper landing technique, things like that. They happen usually in a unilateral stance. So when you land with both feet, probably not going to happen, but if you land on just one foot, with your ankle joint already being supporting the most weight on just both feet, you're increasing the amount of forces and loads that are imposed on that ankle joint in just one leg. So you want to make sure you're moving properly. Yes?
Among individuals, what creates an increased risk of doing that?
This?
Yes.
I
understand if I sprain my ankle already, I'm going to have to happen again.
Yeah, we're talking about ankle instability.
Gotcha.
So his question is, what kind of makes them more at risk? So when you damage those ligaments, you have to repair them. Okay. Also, you can damage nerve tissue and musculoskeletal or musculotendinous tissue. That's going to impact your ability to, in layman's terms, know where your ankle joint is in space, so proprioception. So you could, not knowingly, place your foot in a disadvantageous position and just roll it. So a lot of people who have sprained their ankles before, we'll talk about this in a second, they have what's called joint laxity, meaning they have a lot more range of motion in their joint, being a lot more lax or loose than a normal person who hasn't sprained.
Are you going to talk about pre-sprain?
Like somebody spraining their ankle for the first time?
Yeah, I mean, if you grab 100 people, could you point out and pick out, hey, the characteristics I see right here, you're likely, you're not, you are.
So if we measured foot structure, we could. If we measured just their landing mechanics, how they land, stuff like that, we could definitely say, hey, you're probably going to be at a greater risk. Or, hey, you already have a high arch causing your foot to already be in a supinated position. Yeah, we could definitely do things like
The
that.
ankle thickness, or is that one of them?
That's when you start getting into like looking at x-rays and stuff like that. But we can actually measure the height of their arch and place them in a certain category, so they're supinated or not. And yeah, you could definitely say, like, because again, if you have more of a supinated foot, then when that vertical ground reaction force hits the medial side, you've got a larger moment arm. Greater moment arm with the same amount of force, you're going to produce a greater torque at that joint.
So would that be somebody you would call a layman like flat-footed?
Flat-footed would actually be pronated.
Oh, so the opposite.
Yeah, so
somebody has
high
like
arch.
a high
People
arch.
have high arch, yeah. Because what that does is it forces the foot to align itself, causes the calcaneus to be more internally rotated or adducted, more towards the midline. So those are people that, if you can even look at the bottom of your shoes to kind of tell what type of foot structure you have, or my favorite, in the summer when you get out of the pool and your feet are wet, and you look at your footprints, you can tell if you have a high arch or a flat foot, just doing that.
What I was talking about is like being from Kentucky, you look at a horse, and the conformation is whether they're sound and whether they're apt to get hurt. And horses are highly fragile. You know, you got 1,100 pounds in an ankle that's about the size of my ankle, versus I'm 165, and I got. So I was wondering within individuals, if you see somebody that's got this tiny little ankle, I mean, they probably outrun the Word of God, but they're apt to get hurt a whole lot more versus somebody with big ankles.
So,
I'm very slow, but I never get injured.
So a lot of people have tried to establish a link between like gender and body mass index and things like that as well, like other factors. It's still just.
I think it's funny that my brother and I, we were always about the same size growing up. And our basketball coach used to make fun of him because he had fat ankles, and he would sprain his ankles constantly. And he would make fun of me for having skinny ankles. And I mean, when I trail run, I can look at the bottom of my foot every other step and have all kinds of crazy rolling in my ankle, and it hurts for just a second, but it never swells up. And I mean, I was going to say just the opposite, just from my personal experience.
So that's where you kind of get into the paradigm of, oh, you're out on an unstable surface, so you are fairly aware that you are going to do that. It's when you're completely unexpecting it when that happens.
It's funny, when sometimes I'll roll my ankle on, I don't even know how I do it on the road. I mean, it's a flat road, you wouldn't think there would be any problems. And it'll just catch me by surprise when I'm trail running. You're right, I expect it, and I probably run differently.
So that's where we're trying to get into that paradigm versus, if you know it's coming, do you change your mechanics to, I guess, reduce the amount of inversion that's coming, or do you still have the same movement mechanics and you just activate those peroneals earlier, or things like that? So, I'm getting to that, I'm getting there, I promise. All right, so consequences of a lateral ankle sprain, often viewed by many people as just a trivial injury, not that big of a deal, will resolve fairly quickly, and then bam, get back to what you were doing. However, residual symptoms can be present for more than almost 2 years. So 1.5 years to 2 years, you can still have symptoms from a first-time ankle sprain. And about 45% of individuals that sustain an ankle sprain will not seek proper medical and rehabilitative treatment. Or if we're talking about NCAA athletes, a recent study just came out showing that about 45% of them will return to sport within 24 hours. So basketball player sprains his ankle during the game or practice, he will probably be back the next day. Because what do? We tape him up and put a brace on him. People like to use bracing and taping as a form of rehabilitation when it's not. Okay, so that's a whole other paradigm too, is when you talk about taping and bracing, is that actually beneficial for somebody? Yeah, jury's still out on that one. So chronic ankle instability, this is what happens when you have repetitive ankle sprains or a continuum of symptoms contributing to subjective feelings of ankle joint instability. So about 33% of people that sustain an ankle sprain will develop chronic ankle instability. Defined as a continuum of residual symptoms resulting in recurrent ankle sprains or episodes of the ankle giving way during functional activities. So you could just be walking normally on a nice solid surface and your ankle just gives out on you and you sprain it again. Okay. So, what's kind of the model of chronic ankle instability? How do we know if somebody has chronic ankle instability or not? Well, there's not really an objective measure per se. There's a lot of questionnaires that you can use. But a seminal theory by Friedman and colleagues in 1965, they proposed that it was due to articular deafferentation, meaning your ligaments are innervated with nervous tissue, and they send sensory information to your CNS. And if you sprain your ankle and damage those ligaments, then you're not getting any type of proprioceptive feedback to your CNS about your joint position. So they did a series of studies in cats, other animals, and then even humans where they injected them with numbing medication, lidocaine, or just fluid into the ankle joint, and continuously showed that when they did that, you couldn't replicate passive or active joint range of motion or angles, meaning that the feedback loop was essentially effective. So proprioceptive deficits and inaccurate perception of your ankle joint in space was kind of the theory for over 30 years, and it was never challenged. Never challenged. Everyone was just like, okay, it's definitely a feedback thing. Definitely feedback. Fast forward several years, and it has developed into a feed-forward and feedback model. So what feedback means is that I get feedback from something, and I'm going to change based off of the feedback that I get. Feed-forward means that I'm going to predict, or I'm going to position my joints in an advantageous spot before I actually make contact with the ground. So if we're talking about a jumping movement, when I start to jump and I'm actually in the air prepping for landing, that's considered feed-forward. Okay, after I land and that vertical ground reaction force, or just the ground reaction forces are imposed on my joints, then I'm going to have what's called reactive or reflexive contractions to essentially stabilize my body and my center of mass. So, Jay Hertel, which is like the world-renowned ankle and foot guy, established a model that considers the gamma motor neuron system, so the feed-forward system. So gamma motor neurons are going to adjust the sensitivity and the length of our muscles and things like that. So here, if you look back, it's just sensory information, CNS, alpha motor neurons, extrafusor muscle fibers. But here, we see we were actually going to get sensory information from our gamma motor neuron system as well. So kind of debunking this theory of deafferentation of the CNS, or our sensory fibers. So we actually get substantial information from our gamma motor neuron system, our primary spindle afferents to the CNS, that also help us determine joint position sense too. So when we talk about chronic ankle instability, there's kind of two different types of ankle instability. We have mechanical insufficiencies or functional insufficiencies, or what we call mechanical instability or functional instability. Mechanical instability like I kind of hit on a little bit earlier, was just joint laxity leading to excessive joint range of motion at your ankle, or actual changes in the joint structure. So when you sprain your ankle and your body starts producing new collagen in those ligaments, probably not going to heal the same way as you were before. Okay? Or we can have impaired proprioception, neuromuscular control, or alpha motor neuron excitability, strength deficits, and impaired postural control. These two aren't mutually exclusive, so you could have a combination of mechanical and functional instability leading to kind of this phenomena of chronic ankle instability. So it's not just you have mechanical or you have functional, it's you might have some mechanical insufficiencies and you might have some functional. And then some sensory motor deficits. I generally focus over here on more of the motor and active side. So we look at a lot of landing. Also, when we do laboratory replication of ankle sprains, we look at reflexive contraction. So we look at that monosynaptic stretch reflex when we sprain someone's ankle or simulate spraining it. So that's kind of, I'm more so over here. Because there's been a lot done over here on this passive or sensory side. It's what kind of movement mechanics or adaptations occur if you do have chronic ankle instability. So we're going to actually have some research on here, I'll show you guys. So applications in the biomechanics lab. So you guys are probably wondering, how do you sprain someone's ankle without actually spraining it? Well, we call it a perturbation. So it's just a small enough inversion to stimulate what we want to see. Over here, this is what's called a tilt platform. So you stand on it, and out of nowhere, the bottom is going to drop out from underneath you, so it's going to roll your ankle. Well, a lot of issues wrong with this type of methodology, because when you sprain your ankle, you're never going to be completely weight-bearing in a static position on both feet. So a lot of people don't use this anymore. This was kind of the first laboratory measure that they used to simulate an ankle sprain. What we use is we use what's called a fulcrum. So we either attach a dummy sole to the bottom of their foot, or a sole with a fulcrum that runs right along the medial border. So when it hits the ground, it forces your foot into about 25 degrees of inversion. Now you need in excess of 35 degrees to actually damage your lateral ligament. So we're not even anywhere close to the 35 degrees, but 25 degrees. So they step down, not knowing if they have it on their foot or not. And then it's going to either force them into inversion or be flat-footed. Okay? And then what him and I actually built is we built a tilt platform. So we kind of took this, but we're going to incorporate more of a dynamic situation. So right here, this is where our force plate would actually go. So what we're trying to do with this study is we're going to have them do normal step-down trials, such as you're walking down the stairs on this flat thing right here. And then we're going to give them 10 trials to step down, not knowing what they're stepping down onto. So they're going to hold a cardboard box or something so they can't see their feet. And one trial, just one, we're going to slide this in underneath them and see what happens. Because the issue with this right here, and even this one, is after you're exposed to that stimulus, you're going to expect it. You're going to expect it, just kind of like when you're running. Even though you're probably not consciously thinking about it, but in the back of your mind, you know that you are running on an unstable surface, so you are going to anticipate any type of inversion perturbation that occurs.
Do you tell them that 1 time out of 10 that that's coming?
In the informed consent, we will, but when they come in for familiarization, we're not going to let them step on it. So they're not even going to know. IRBs did, so we're like, oh, expedited.
But they know at least 1 time out of 10 something different's coming.
So it's only going to happen once. So it could be on their very first trial, or it could be on the 6th trial, or it could be on the 4th trial.
Devil's advocate, would
So-
that not potentially put me on guard all the time?
Put you on guard. So if you were a participant, you'd probably be like, okay,
I'm
I know.
anticipating that every step.
So,
is that possible?
The good thing is yes, you might be anticipating it to a sense, but you have no idea the magnitude or how much it is that you're stepping down onto. Because we're not going to physically let you see that platform until after you step on it. So we kind of derived this protocol from Dr. Chander's slip protocol. He initiates slip. So we have our floor in our lab is kind of like this. So if you put some glycerol and water solution on it, slip right out from underneath. We have a harness that we put on them so they don't just fall down. But that's what he did, and his slip research is he has them just do normal gait trials, and then one time, squirt some saline and water on the force plate, and when they walk through, get an unexpected slip. So after they've been exposed to it, then like you said, I'm just going to be expecting it every time. So after that, then we're just going to say, okay, get back up there. You are stepping down onto this inverted surface. So we're going to look at the differences between normal stepping down and unexpected perturbation, and then if they know it's coming, what are the differences, biomechanically and neurologically, what are the differences? So that's kind of what we're getting into now. But again, lots of hurdles you have to overcome when you are trying to expose somebody to.
If you put me through that, am I contaminated the next time you do a study?
So like if I bring you back like a year later, be like, hey, we're using the same protocol. Probably because you've been exposed to it, but that's just kind of like you said, that's just one thing, one limitation that you have to accept.
Would your IRB let you get away with telling them it's just going to be this and totally unexpected?
Yeah, deception, our IRB is not very high. So there's an actual part in the IRB protocol that says, are your participants being deceptive in any manner? We have to basically say yes, but we're going to make them aware in the informed consent. Because if we let them practice this, then they know the magnitude and everything. So then so that's the struggle with studying injury mechanics for any of you interested in injuries. You can't physically hurt people in a lab. So it makes it really difficult. I mean, you can, it's frowned upon, but it makes it really, really difficult to really see what occurs during these situations. So what a lot of people have done is they've taken videos from like game footage, and they analyze real-time scenarios. But you can't get EMG, you can't get ground reaction forces, you can just get kinematics. You know, all those other factors, ground reaction forces and kinematics, just as important. All right, so motor control strategies are what happens if you do have chronic ankle instability and you want to return back to sport or do whatever it is that you're doing. So a study by Caulfield and Garrett, they looked at just ground reaction forces during a stop jump. So they had somebody jump forward and land on a force plate. Well, they showed that people with chronic ankle instability have a faster peak lateral force. So the time it takes them to reach the peak lateral force, meaning there is a faster rate of loading on their lateral ligaments during a stop jump task. Okay, that could contribute to their ankle giving way and boom, spraining their ankle again. Just kind of rush through these because I want him to really talk to. This study right here looked at a cross-cutting maneuver, so kind of planting and cutting. So what happens there? Well, while no differences were shown in ankle joint range of motion here, we start to see more proximal changes. So changes more at the knee and the hip. So while you do have that constraint of ankle stability, a lot of the studies show that your ankle joint motion might not change, but you alter the position of more proximal segments to kind of compensate for that. So if I know that I'm going to be cutting, I know that I need to kind of reduce the amount of reliance on my ankle to dissipate the ground reaction force to more proximal segments such as my knee and my hip. So in a cross-cutting maneuver, this has been shown between healthy or controls and people with chronic ankle instability. And then here, another landing task. This is looking at EMG. So we've had a ground reaction force study, kinematic study, just looking at joint position. EMG. So this is where we get into that neuromuscular stuff. Solid line here, doing a landing task, indicates the instability group, followed by the open dotted line here, which is the control. So we can see that controls have greater amount of peroneus longus activity over here. So going back to the muscle circle, who remembers what peroneus longus does? At the ankle? Eversion. So that's going to counteract any excessive inversion. So they show that the peroneus longus muscle activity is actually less in people with chronic ankle instability. So there's less joint stability there when someone's landing. Again, if their foot's slightly into inversion, could force them again into excessive inversion and result in another sprain. So my research, future research, I think I've already kind of talked about this. Ankle sprains are really common in occupations, but no one's really investigated those areas. A lot of people are just focused on dynamic tasks in sports, Like you think about military, railroad workers, construction workers, anyone who's exposed to irregular terrain has a really good chance of rolling their ankle or their ankle giving way. So actually in railroad workers, and even in the military, ankle sprains are still the most common injury. People will have to return to work, okay? So they might not get paid workman's comp. So chronic ankle instability has been investigated in athletic populations all across the board when it comes to athletics. But much remains unknown about occupational population. So we've studied postural control, gait, ankle inversion. We've started getting into dynamic movements such as landing, cutting, things like that. But no one has looked at if someone's exposed to irregular terrain with chronic ankle instability, what happens? So that's kind of where I'm headed. This was, yes.
Are there studies that exist for it that look at a warmed up versus a cold situation?
So like they do a warm up first and then they.
Just internal temperature has an impact on this instability or not.
So like if you submerge their ankle into like ice or not?
Water versus warm up.
I'm not aware of anything with ankle stuff. I know when you look at tactile and stuff with hands, people have done cold water submersion, for sure. I'm not aware of anything, but
Well, the reason I
doesn't
ask
mean it doesn't exist because I haven't focused on that.
right.
But that would be interesting because that's the first thing that people do when they sprain their ankle is ice it.
Well, and we're also convinced if we don't warm up, we're going to get injured. Well, I don't know if there's any.
Yeah, so that's another issue. For whatever reason, our IRB doesn't like if we don't put them through a warm-up. But when you look at just, if we just have them come in and just do just this, we just have them come in and say, hey, put these shoes on, step down, see like, but if we're having them do dynamic tasks, then IRB wants them to warm up.
Without justification, it seems, right?
Yeah, because we're like, oh, this helps them not get injured, and we're like, well, show me where. But yeah, any questions from you, or we can hold Q&A till the end.
Right. So I'm a little different than Jeff. I tend to stay on the more sports performance side, specifically in baseball. The baseball swing is very, very under-researched, and I really want to know what makes certain athletes better than others. So when we look at this, we have two very, very different types of swings, but two very, very good hitters. So we have King Griffey, we have Jeff Bagwell, and both of them showed a lot of success in their sport, but they look very different doing it. So this is one of those tasks you can see in basketball. You'll see some people that have great form that we were taught that elbow needs to be here, needs to go straight up, and then you'll see like Alonzo Ball comes around and hit the ball down to his head. But there's still a lot of success happening in these athletes. So I'm interested to see if what's being taught is actually what's changing performance. So right now I'm focusing on baseball. My big thing is trying to figure out what changes during the baseball swing that affects these players' performance. And so far I'm sticking with mostly lower extremity. So sticking with the biomechanics side that we talked about. First we'll talk about the kinematics. It's been looked at, so in 1986, there was a study that took 7 collegiate baseball players and they split them into 2 groups. Skilled was 5 of them, and lesser skilled was 2. I feel kind of bad about those groups. You know, coach is like, hey, you're lesser skilled, you're in that group. I mean, that's what happens. So this is very weird to me, because skill level is something that's very, very argued. How to define who's higher skilled and who's lesser skilled. In this study, they said, this coach says they're lesser skilled, and it was based on their hip rotation. But at this point, they didn't know if hip rotation was actually something that went towards skill. So they did this study, they found that they created a higher bat velocity prior to impact. So you think of someone with more skill, you think they're going to swing harder, they can transfer more force to the ball. Cool, we'll accept that. So we go to 2011. This study looked at 20 subjects, split into 2 groups, 10 and 10, and they looked at differences, and they split them into 2 groups based on their batting average, which, yeah, kind of fair. I mean, that's how we justify how good somebody's in baseball, but then you get into the fact, like, you see different pitches, someone that's lower in the lineup isn't going to see as many curveballs as somebody at the top, so is it really needing a better or worse? There's a lot of performance variables that I'm looking at. But then they also did a coach's rating scale. So what they found between the two groups was that the maximal bat velocity before impact was also still higher for their higher skilled group. So this is pretty much widely accepted that a higher skilled batter will have more bat velocity. But this also means that they have to be well versed in the skill. So you can't just take somebody out and be like, let's see who swings harder, they're going to be better. You have to be well versed in the skill. They had a higher lead elbow, maximum angular velocity, they had higher angular velocity at the hip segment, and a higher right knee angle at ball contact. So this is their back knee here. But in my opinion, this is why I'm getting into this research, is every single batter has a different stance. So if we're saying that they have to have the same knee angle and a lower knee angle is better, why isn't that true for everyone? So I'm trying to see if there's specific other things that apply. So these are our spatial characteristics. We get to Dowling and Fleissig. So this is a recent study. This is probably one of the most well-versed studies. They had 170 baseball hitters. It's a huge group to look for. This is one of the biggest baseball biomechanics labs. And they looked at a lot of different things. But again, they found a lot of differences just in the upper extremity. So they found back shoulder abduction, so how far the back shoulder was away from the body when at contact. The back elbow flexion, so how much their elbow is bent, and lead elbow extension. It's also when I put that on here. So how much is here and bent at the same time. And they also found that as composition level increased, bat velocity still increased. So we're seeing something that's pretty well known, that as skill level increases and they're well versed, they will have a higher bat velocity when it comes to contact. So then, the one thing that's missing in a lot of these studies is lower extremity. So we're missing a lot of the lower extremity variables. So then we see Kinsman in 1964. They used 4 subjects, 2 skilled, 2 unskilled. That's what they said. Don't really know what separated them. They looked at just the pec major, the triceps, long and outer head, and latissimus dorsi, and they said that if you strengthen the lead arm triceps, you would increase the force transfer to the bat. That was their main finding, which in 1964, using EMG, was pretty cool to see. Then we get to 67. Brower et al. Looked at one batter and just looked at muscle activity, the upper extremity, lower extremity, and 3 trunk muscles. And their main finding was if you strengthen muscles in the core, that's important for trunk stabilization. But that's what we know. That's what everyone knows, that your trunk is stabilized by your core muscles. So again, a lot of research that we're not really sure what's going on. So then we get to 2013. This is where my study starts to come in, because they start to look at stuff that I actually find interesting. So they Nakata et al. Looked at 20 subjects. They had 10 subjects who had played collegiate baseball. They had 10 subjects who had never played baseball a day in their lives. Soccer players and dancers, never swung a bat, had no idea what they were doing. And they compared these two to look at muscle activation differences and timing for swing phases. They found some differences, and the rectus femoris, biceps femoris, and lead and back legs, so you get your hamstrings, your quads, your gastrocs, and your tibialis anterior of your front leg. So I took this because, yeah, cool, you found some differences, but how does that apply to an actual baseball population? You found that people that are versed in the skill have this higher activation, but how does it apply to an actual population of baseball players? Are there actually differences between people of different skills? So they found some EMG differences, but the big difference that I looked at, because this is where I think differences might come in, because we know that everyone has a different strategy for how they approach the plate. Some people stand up, some people squat down, some people are really open, some people don't move their legs at all. They just take a little step. But the one thing you always see is their timing is around the same. So what this study showed is that during the shifting, stepping, landing, and swing phase, there were differences between the two groups. So that's when those phases start. So the shifting phase in this and in my study, which I'll talk about in a second, is defined as the point in which your biceps femoris increases 2 standard deviations above the regular. So your onset of your biceps femoris. Your stepping is just when your front leg comes off the ground. Landing is when it comes back down. And swing is when your hand starts moving towards the ball. So when you watch a baseball player, they'll be here. They'll shift their weight back, so that little shift is the initiation of swing. Step, land. And as you're stepping, you'll notice the hands are, it's kind of like a wind-up, and the swing phase starts when the hands start to come back down. And the interesting thing they found was that here, the unskilled players who had never played baseball started swinging, so this is all relative to contact in milliseconds. So they started swinging the bat, I don't know if you can see this, so 311 milliseconds before contact they started swinging, but their foot didn't touch the ground until 274 milliseconds. No baseball player that you actually see will that happen to. That's not a it's not something that happens in baseball players who are used to swinging a baseball bat. You don't start coming down before your foot hits the ground. There's a specific cadence. So what I was looking at, I decided that their study was on the right lines, but it doesn't show us what we're really looking at. So I took their two-group prospective observational study, but I separated it into a skilled group, meaning players who had played at a collegiate level before, and a recreational group who was around the same age, not necessarily age matched, but had never played collegiate baseball, and only played on like high school level up, and then stayed playing recreationally, either for a club baseball team or like an adult league, but never made it to an NCAA Division III or higher level. And I looked at the skill as my dependent variable to see if there were differences between the two. And the dependent variable was peak muscle activity, mean muscle activity, and start times to swing phases. And I used bat velocity to show that there were true differences between the groups, because that is shown to be different between groups that actually play baseball. So we look at mean muscle activity, and we'll go to the next one too, peak muscle activity. The correlation between these two graphs that you see, most time our skilled group, the players who played in college, had lower muscle activity. So for peak muscle activity, this is where you start to think they don't need it as much. So you think as someone gets more skilled, they actually become, I would say, more efficient with their swing. But efficiency would show that they actually use less muscle activity over the entire duration. And for mean, we see that there's less muscle activity, but the problem with that is, when you look at the swing times, the skilled players started their swing much earlier. So there was around the same muscle activity, but because they had a longer swing phase, they spent more time during the swing process. They had about the same muscle activity, but it was elongated, so it made their mean go down. So looking at the area underneath the curve was the same, the mean went down because it was over such a long period of time. So my main finding here, we found that the bat velocity was different, so our two groups were statistically different in skill level, or how well they could actually perform the swing. But our skilled groups started shifting, so they started their swing earlier and started stepping much earlier than the recreational group. So they actually gave themselves more time during the swing. And landing and swinging probably could have gone more significant. The problem we had with this, we had a relatively low sample size. We had 7 and 7, so it was relatively low. For most baseball research, you see anywhere from like 2 to 2 to 10 and 10, but you never see more than 20 subjects. So we're in that level, but it was starting to differentiate a little bit. But we think with more subjects, you could have actually seen a difference, where the skilled players are still starting these earlier and getting through their swing quicker. So this is what I'm looking at to do here at State. So now that I'm with Jeff, I'm doing a lot of the CAI study, so it's really cool to me, really intrigued, but I really like the sports performance side. So I'm trying to stick with people and figure out why some people are better at what they do. So the IRB I have in right now is looking at a collegiate level player versus a high school player to see if competition level, so we know there's going to be some differences in skill because there's very, very big differences in where they compete. We know the players get better as they go up. So I'm going to see if those same differences are seen, to see if this is something that players have to adjust to as they go. Because there are so many different forms of the stance, I can go watch a baseball game now, and you'll watch player after player come up and swing swing completely different than the person before them, the person after them. Because there's no set way, it's how you feel most comfortable at the plate. But the one thing you see is they step, get the foot down, and start swinging in a specific order. And they get it through and get the timing down to make it contact. So what I'm trying to do here is show that collegiate players and high school players have that distinct pathway where their swing happens in a specific order. So it's not necessarily that players need certain kinematic parameters where they need this much knee angle and this much elbow angle to produce this much. It's more about a timing and working the kinetic chain up through to get the proper force to the bat. And that's just what I'm working on now. And I'm actually working with Jeff. We're processing my thesis data right now to look at the kinetic data, to look at our forces, to see if there's a difference in forces between the two groups, to see if there's more of a force transfer into the front foot during the swing for our higher skill players. And this is just Aaron Judge, because he's really good. Not because I like the Yankees. I'm a huge Reds fan, and we're really, really bad, so. Yeah. Questions for either of us?
I tend to give the human body a whole lot of credit for figuring things out.
Right.
Like if you take a 6-year-old and say, jump as high as you can, you don't have to explain to them that they squat first and then jump. I mean, that's kind of in us, kind of like a duck can swim without being taught. Have you, or are you aware of research where the progression across time, how long does it take somebody to learn this? And would your skill, I mean, a soccer player is a skilled athlete. If you let them have a bat and play long enough, would they adopt what you're talking about?
See, that's something that the baseball swing, the reason I'm getting into this, is all research in baseball is pitching. Because everybody loves a pitcher. Pitcher is there to make sure there's not a lot of runs scored. But on the opposite side of that, it's hitting, and people just haven't looked at hitting. So what I'm interested in, again, is the skill, and if it progresses. So if you can take someone at a young age and tell them, this is like the order, if you can progress over time, that would say that this is be a learned skill.
Would they adopt that without being taught?
That's what I'm not sure, because I don't think anybody's necessarily looked at novices, but there was a warm-up trial of 5 swings that you were told this was taught. It wasn't like, hey, you're going to come in for so many days and get to swing.
If you had to guess, would you think there's the learning curve would eventually get a decent athlete into the correct sequence? Even if it took a year or longer?
I would think over time, I would say yes.
So, in like the neuromechanics aspect, we talked about positive and negative transfer. So probably people who are kind of, I guess, used to that type of movement. So you take a golfer or let's say a tennis player and you give them a baseball bat and like swing this. Probably going to be some good positive transfer there. Versus if we just took like a soccer player and gave them a bat.
It's going to take them a lot more time.
It might take them a lot more time, but they might figure it out. Because then you can start getting into what is their motor program. And if they have kind of a reproductive motor program every time they do it, so the more times you do it, you're going to get better to a certain point, and then you're going to kind of stay here. And if it's, can we get this? Because he'll probably tell you, people can probably have these attributes that he's looking for, but their batting average might suck, might be horrible. So then we're going to say, oh, they're not a good hitter. But from a scientific aspect, when we look at these variables, we can say, hey, timing's there, all that stuff is there. It's just batting average isn't. So.
Right. So what I'm looking at doing, building on that, is you can know that these batters have been skilled and they have the right. We know that if you look at somebody in the MLB and say their batting average is going down, but their timing is right, the way they use that kinetic chain is right. The problem could be more on like a vision level. Are they seeing the ball well, stuff like that. So I'm looking at finding the characteristics of the body and just the body in space, and not necessarily your vision or how you perceive what's going to happen. Because with baseball, there's a lot going on at once. You have the pitcher using a variety of pitches. You go anywhere from like a curveball at 80 to a changeup at 60 to a fastball at 100. And you can see all those in a variety of the game, and we expect them to go up and still be successful 3 out of 10 times. And that's what we consider as decent in baseball. But there's a lot that plays into that. So I'm working on building from the base up to see what characteristics start. And then if you have somebody that is struggling, that has the right characteristics, then we can find out that it's something else.
We're almost seem like you might at some point have almost a chi-square situation where you take X number of players, evaluate them, and classify them as, do they have the correct sequence, so to speak, to be good or not, and see if you're, and then you don't know their batting average, and then see if that sequence actually puts them into the good or not category, and almost if it's predictive.
Right. That's what I think. There will be a time when you can actually look at an athlete, and if we figure out what the proper progression is from starting at youth up through middle age into high school into collegiate professional, if we can figure out the right way of the transitions, then we can figure out this is where you need to be. This is bad.
You know, too, here's another, if I'm a scout, and I'm about to try to pay you several $1 million a year,
Right.
it'd be interesting to know, one of your studies that you cited said the coach identified them as skilled or not. Well, the coach knows their batting average, that seems a little biased. So if I'm a scout and I've never seen you play before, can I watch you and say yes or no, you've got the sequence it takes to be good? That would be really neat to know.
I'm trying to develop a way for coaches to help train their players to become better. And if we figure out that right way, we figure out the right sequence, then that can be applied to a scout looking at a player saying, this is right. I'm not huge on this reference, but Tim Tebow. So he goes from playing collegiate football, playing single A baseball. And he batted, what, 226? Which isn't terrible, but for single A you expect someone to make it to the pros, you're going to bat a lot higher. But he showed success because he had that right sequence. And his problem was if he saw a fastball, he'd hit it out of the park. He had no problem. But his batting average went down when he saw a curveball. So his sequence was right. He has the right movements, according to what's been said before, but he's not good with the off-speed pitch. So that's a completely separate game, whereas I think when you talk about a scout, they're not only looking at those performance variables where they can hit a ball 500 feet, like it's crazy, like a Bryce Harper in high school, that man could crush a ball, but he was also able to take the opposite field to hit the pitch that was out. So I think with a scout, it's not necessarily looking at certain parameters, it's seeing performance in various places. And I think that's just something that comes, I don't want to say necessarily with age, I think that's more practice. I think repetition, you can build those motor programs to certain things. And with a motor program, knowing, I talked about this with my advisor at UK, at this point in MLB, we know there's this many outs, the count is this, with this pitcher, they're probably going to throw this pitch. And the players know what to expect. So they actually use a different motor program, depending on what the count is, where players on the field, because they know where the pitch and what the pitches they think is going to be, because the amount of time they have to swing is very, very little. So without looking at those, I want to develop this, and then see if it changes based on what kind of pitch it would be, and how it goes throughout that.
I've got a comment, question / help our undergrads that are looking at this field. So when they take motor learning, have any of you guys had motor learning yet? Do you remember the swimming article you had to analyze?
I think it was based on different types of stroke.
Okay, so you remember that article, because Dr. Allen teaches now, I used to teach it, she kind of, and you do it online, or did you do it online? Or
It was all online.
So what was really cool about this article, and I'm not my only background in kinematics, kinetics is because I had to teach motor learning.
Right.
My first semester, they were like, you're teaching motor learning. I was like, I don't have any background in motor learning, but you're going to teach it. But we found some really cool articles, and the first article that they have to critique in that class, they take world-class swimmers, male and female, and analyze their stroke in slow motion, like we did upstairs. And the really cool part was you find that male and female front crawl, whatever you call the normal, is it crawl? Is that correct? Jeff, you were a swimmer, weren't you? When you swim like this, I know it's a good example.
That's called drowning.
Yeah. But you know where you're swimming forward, you're not doing the butterfly, and so all these coaches have been coaching incorrectly for years because the article that Heather had to critique, they were looking at the entry point for your trail arm. So you from here to here is trail, and then once it hits the water, it becomes pull arm. Some terminology, And so they were coaching these elite male and female swimmers the same way, and they kept trying to get the female swimmers to have the same entry point. You know, the longer your hands out of the water, the more you're gliding. I guess, I don't know the technical term for it. But anyway, so that's the article. So before somebody that did what these guys do, you say, well, hey, you teach all swimmers the same way. Well, they found out that the males, they had a strong enough stroke that once your hand goes in the water, you're instantly slowing yourself down. But the propulsion they had was great enough that it overcame having a shorter glide phase. In world class, I mean, these were national, international level competitors. And no matter how much they tried to speed the entry for the female swimmers' hands up, it still resulted in slower swimming time. So they were coaching these people the wrong way for forever.
Right.
And I think that's neat. With, you know, baseball, Dr. Green was a great baseball player back in the day, right? So anyway, but you know, we have all these coaches and we say things, and we say them because somebody before us said to do it.
Right.
And so this comes into my next little kind of comment. So you said you want to study baseball. Well, what do you want to do with baseball after you finish your PhD?
So I'm looking at more going towards like a 4-year university and teaching, but I want to keep working with baseball. That way I can help coaches and help the whole sport as a whole. Not necessarily go into working in a baseball biomechanics lab, because I really love the teaching aspect. I loved teaching in a classroom, which is not what I would have said 3 years ago. But I love talking about biomechanics. And just because I love baseball doesn't mean everybody in this room is going to love baseball. But I want you to find what you like and what you're interested in biomechanics. So I want to teach at university, but still have an opportunity to do the baseball research.
And that's because we don't have a biomechanics person on our campus. Do it.
You could.
Well, Johnny Long, he's our biomechanics expert. But you know, this, you know, we get into like our students. So okay, what do we do with this? And read that journal article. I'm sure Heather's going, why did Dr. Helm-Allen make me read this? This is awful. And that's why I was hoping we'd have a big contingency students to update. So you could finish your PhD and go work for Major League Baseball.
Right. That's what. So my advisor at UK finished his PhD at Penn State, and as soon as he graduated, he worked for the White Sox for 5 years as a pitching biomechanist. So what he showed, this is actually funny because pitching coaches are notorious for telling you to do things a certain way. They talk about when you throw a curveball, it needs to be this much, but you actually see the way they throw in slow motion. That's not how they throw at all. The pitch is actually out here. You can tell fastball's coming through here, a curveball's all the way out here. But the way a pitching coach will tell you is you're coming right here, by your ear still. And that's just not the way it happens. So what he did when he was there is he was trying to tell them, look, this is how it's actually done. This is what you need to tell your guys because this is going to be the best way to coach them. And they stuck with their ways. So that's when he left the MLB world. But
yeah, great. And that's, I'm sorry that long swimming story, and I don't know anything about swimming is obvious, but that, you know, that's what Dr. Killen and Dr. Green and I try to get over with, getting involved with research. You know, I think a lot of our undergrads think that means you just keep reading and that's all you do. But the purpose is to improve some aspect of life for some individual. And, you know, there's a lot of really neat stuff that you can do when you get into this field. And I'm glad we're going to record this and put it online. But if you want to work for Major League Baseball, either be an awesome baseball player, or be an awesome baseball player and become a coach, or work in the ticket office, or get involved with research.
Right.
You become a consultant, and so you can still be involved with the sport that you love, and you get to look at it to the tiniest microscopic level on what makes people better, looking at 180 frames per second of a pitching analysis, and that's what Jeff's buddy that was here, he works for New Balance now. And there's so many things you can do in exercise science besides coming to physical therapists. And a lot of our students, they just don't realize that.
We actually had probably 3 or 4 students that were in our undergrad research group the first year, and they both wanted to go to PT and OT school, or I think one wanted to go to DO school or something like that. And after one semester of being involved in research, they gave up PTOT and are now masters and wanting to go on a PhD.
That was me. When I was an undergrad, I was a senior, first semester, went to go PT school, and I took my biomechanics class and got involved in research, and now I'm a PhD student in biomechanics. Yeah, I think, so for me, it's not necessarily just staying in baseball or just baseball hitting. I think the sports performance side to me, so Jeff does, I want to say love injuries, but he wants to help prevent injuries. He wants to find the mechanism and find the way to prevent them. For me, I want to look at an athlete and tell them, you're good, this is what you can do to be better. So, that's my thing.
So we hate when injuries happen, so
Right.
I know
We're not
we get really excited, but they're good teaching moments because you get to say like, hey, the human body probably shouldn't have been that way, or hey, it probably shouldn't look like that whenever this occurs. And then we try to trace it backwards. So what happened? Was it a bad motor program, or was their ankle positioned in this position prior to landing? Things like that. We pinpoint and kind of start closing those gaps. Now, injuries are never going to be 100% preventable, but if it's something as simple as, oh, flexing your knees a little bit more, or maybe having a little bit more plantar flexion and knee extension at landing to absorb that ground action force, you might reduce ankle injuries and, heaven forbid, ACL, which is another issue for another day. There's people that devote their entire life to studying ACL injuries. So,
And, I mean, I want to say, I'm not just sports performance. I have a paper in review about injury risk and plyometric exercises. So just because I pick sports performance doesn't mean I'm only going to work with sports the rest of my life. You can get involved in other things. And especially, that's why I love Mississippi State, because I have my history in sports performance. Jeff has history working with ankles and foot and doing load carriage and stuff. So I'm getting involved in other things. So there's all kinds of stuff to get involved in, even if you want to specify one thing.
and just so, if anyone's interested in like research, and I think Dr. O'Neill and Green might agree with this, there is a lot of money in occupational research. So for a certain occupation, military, firefighter, police. Like I said, during my stuff, everyone gets really carried away with athletes and sports performance, but companies lose millions and millions of dollars every year due to injuries. So we call it ergonomics, human factors in ergonomics. It's a gray area. That's what one of our advisors does. He does all slips and postural control in the workplace. Because the loss of balance and falls is the #1 leading cause of workman's comp claims. So he's trying to find ways to prevent falls and slips in the workplace. So again, I feel like we could sit here all day and talk about every little thing you could get into, but you just have to find what you're interested in or what interests you, and just kind of go with it. So
Advice. You want to be a researcher one day. You're an undergrad. What should you do?
Just get involved. So what I always told my students, since I've taught undergrad for 2 years, 2.5 years, is if you want to do research, just one, go in and be involved in research, not just try to be on the research team. Go and actually do the research. See what's happening. So if you go and you're a subject, it's really cool to see what's happening behind the scenes because you can see how it all works. And then once you're a subject, if you like it, then you can try to get involved more into other things. And I think the key is really just getting involved in any way possible.
yeah, so outside of getting involved, I would try to find somebody who has a research area that you're interested in and ask them questions. Because they could probably tell you more than I could in an area outside of what I study and what I look at. Because I don't want to repeat what he said. But you know, if you like ACL injuries or ACL rehab or training programs to prevent that, you need to find an expert in that respective area and ask them questions. Because that's how you find out what has or hasn't been done. That's how you stimulate research questions. I mean, it seems like every time I talk to Dr. O'Neill on the phone, I write down probably 3 research questions that we just think of while we're talking. So I've got like an entire notebook of probably like 50 research questions that we've come up with. So again, that's how you get involved, is just talking to somebody.
and you guys will be college faculty members in a couple of years. When you're looking for students to enter your master's program, what do you think, based on what helped you get into your programs at Kentucky or Mississippi State or what do you think is most important? Like, you want this on your resume when you get
So, whenever I talk with Dr. Knight and Dr. Trainer, so Dr. Knight is my major advisor, and then Dr. Trainer is kind of my second. Whenever I talked to them about my application, after I'd already been accepted and started there, they told me that they really didn't care too much about GPA. Like, yes, you have to meet like the required GPA, but they were like, we looked at what you were involved in the lab and outside of school. That really made our decision pretty much a no-brainer. So when I was here during my master's, I think we had 4 or 5 studies going that we were always collecting on and doing, as well as we submitted a grant to do a research project when we went to Peru. So that right there was enough for them to show or see that we are productive. Because if you go to a grad program, it's not just, I'm going to go sit in class and then I'm going to go home and chill and hang out. It's what you're doing outside of the classroom to be productive, to further the field, further your education, is what they look at. So yeah, you could apply to a PhD program or even a master's program as a 4.0 student who was, the president of your fraternity or whatever. But if you have no research experience or didn't show that you got outside of that and made yourself more well-rounded, they don't care. They're just saying no. So PhD, it's more like that than a master's because they realize that a lot of schools don't really let their undergrads help out. At Mississippi State, they really didn't let their undergrads help out until we got there and we put together the research group that they have now. So it really just depends on the university that you're at too.
Yeah, I would say for me, if I'm accepting someone for a master's program, it's just showing your interest in that. So showing that you've taken the classes to get there, you're interested in something that I can help you with. So if you're interested in like sports performance or something like that. But for a PhD program, especially after a master's program, it's the research involved. The big draw for me for staying, when I talked to them, it's that I was involved in research. I've worked on 4 different research projects while I was in my master's program. I spent an entire year running research, which I'm not a huge runner, but watching people run and seeing how their kinematics change based on hip flexibility, which is something I never would have thought of, was really cool. I really enjoyed helping with that. And I helped with like an obesity study, and then I did my study, and then I helped with the golf study. So getting involved in that research, especially when you're trying to get to a PhD program, is the big thing that helps me get in.
I think another good piece of advice if you're looking at a grad program is making sure you can go somewhere where they will allow you to do what you want to do. So if you are a master's student looking to go to a PhD and you want to continue along your line of research, you need to find somebody or a school that will allow you to do that, because Dr. O'Neill and Dr. Green, Dr. Killen will probably tell you that a lot of times students go to schools thinking they can do one thing, and then their advisor just comes to their desk and says, hey, this is what you're doing for the next 3 years, go do it. I've seen it happen. It's happening right now at our school with some students. But again, you want to go, because I'll tell you, you'll be miserable if you do something you don't like or you don't enjoy.
How many hours a week do you think you spend involved with research?
Ask Tia. Every time I think Tia came by the lab, I was there.
Yeah.
I go into work every morning, so I only teach, I teach 2 classes, but I am in the lab from 7 a.m. until about 6 or 7 o'clock at night every day, regardless of if I'm in class collecting data. Because in the time that you're not collecting data or not in class, you should be reading or you should be writing. So, yeah, I'd probably say, and even when we were here, I did my master's in 1 year. I think you guys give them the option a year and a half. The semester we took research methods, we were probably up here working probably 60, 70 hours a week. So,
I'm in the lab. We're in the lab writing a lot. There's a lot of times when Jeff and I will be in the office together for like 6, 7 hours.